Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Keagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
Dr. Jeffrey K., welcome to Fortress on a Hill. Thank you for coming back to chat with me about your most recent work.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. Let's go.
So, Dr. K is a highly respected psychologist and an expert on current torture and rendition techniques and developments. He writes on torture and other subjects for Firedog Lake, Truth Out, and then most recently, what we're talking about today, his current run at Counterpunch. Article is titled CIA, MK Ultra, and the cover-up of U.S. germ warfare in the Korean War. So, Dr. K, would you take us through briefly on your article, what you've discovered and how recent discoveries may have changed how some of these events, looking back on them, look.
Okay, one thing I do want to say, because the Board of Psychology in California might be interested in these things. I'm technically a retired psychologist. I'm supposed to say that because I'm not currently licensed. My licensure went with my retirement. So I'm sorry. So you're asking me again
about your most recent article discussing
Yes.
about the forced retractions of American POWs,
Right.
and
Right.
about how the beginnings of Project Bluebird, and I can drop
Right.
the other one
Yes.
into MK Ultra.
Right, right. And we could add the word brainwashing, because that's probably what a lot of your listeners are familiar with from popular culture and terminology, because that's when the whole idea of brainwashing began. Well, technically, it began even before the Korean War, as the Cold War began. And really, our story begins before the Korean War, with the onset of the Cold War, a hard Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States in the mid to late 1940s. And during that period, there were a series of trials in East Europe. Particularly a famous one was in Hungary, Cardinal Mindszenty, and another guy from IT&T, Robert Vogler. He was an American business executive in Hungary. And he and Cardinal, these guys were charged with espionage in Hungary against the Soviet Union on behalf of the United States. And arguably or not, they were tortured in custody. And when and there's controversy over that. And then when they came time for the trial, they confessed to, in fact, espionage and being working for the United States intelligence services and military. Well, this, of course, would later happen. The exact same things would happen with except it wasn't a trial, but they were in a POW camp. But the same thing would happen with U.S. flyers who were captured by North Korea and China, down planes during the Korean War, who then confessed to use of biological warfare to their captors. And arguably, controversially, under torture or not. They later recanted, as did Robert Vogler when he returned to the United States ultimately. But what was similar was, why did they confess? Why did they say they were doing these things if they were false confessions? Well, just this year, in the Journal of Cold War Studies, I believe it is, published, MIT Press, published a big article on the Vogler case. And bringing out all the information. It turns out all these years later, and this is the pretty much the first instance of an American source saying this, Vogler was guilty. He did, in fact, collaborate with U.S. intelligence. His confession was true. He may have been tortured to get that confession. I don't know. I haven't looked deeply enough into the case. But what's interesting is that today, Cold War scholarship in the United States admits that this man's so-called false confession was really true. And that's what I'm saying about the 25 or so confessions that were printed by the Chinese government of various high-ranking, some of them very high-ranking officials who said that the United States had implemented what initially was an experimental program of biological warfare in Korea, and then later expanded that out as the war went on. Since then, there's been lots of evidence that was circumstantially supporting those assertions. There was also some evidence published that supposedly disproved it by saying this was all a hoax, formed by the communists. What I discovered, and concurrently, roughly around the same time, so did another researcher, Nicholson Baker, who's a fairly well-known author, discovered a number of documents that the CIA had released 10 years ago. And now 10 years ago. At the time I found them, it was maybe 4 or 5 years previously. Anyways, part of a release called Baptism by Fire to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Korean War beginnings. And I hunted through those documents and discovered that about 24 of them discussed, these documents were communications intelligence reports by analysts in Korea back to headquarters, looking at communications intercepts decrypted for the Armed Forces Security Agency, which was a predecessor of today's NSA, National Security Agency. They had cryptologists. They intercepted radio communications from one military unit to another. They decrypted those communications and reported and sent them out to their clients, which was the CIA, military intelligence, et cetera, so that they could know what's going on in the field. This is not an unusual thing. This is what most armies do today and have done for some time. In fact, a lot of the information about what we know about the Holocaust, as it unfolded, at least initially in East Europe, was discovered through communications intercepts by historians later that came out in the 80s and 90s. So these communications intercepts showed various Chinese and North Korean units reporting that they were being attacked by biological weapons, by insects being dropped, et cetera. In some cases, they were in terrible straits. In other cases, the charges turned out to be not true. It was a mistaken report. So it has the feel of verisimilitude. And of course, its origins, the documents are from the CIA. So we're not even reading documents from some communist source. This is from the CIA. And that's what these documents say. So that came out. And I believe that really substantiated the charges that the flyers made in the 1952 and 53 when these confessions were released over a period of time. And there have been other scholars who've worked on other aspects of this. Nicholson Baker is one. The late Canadian scholars Stephen Endicott and Edward Harriman were others, and there have been a number of others. What I'm trying to do is put it together as well as I can. This is really a wide open area of U.S. history because it's been closed off. And in fact, part of this past year, one of the discoveries I made that was quite shocking to me personally was the extent of censorship that was the United States population was subjected to in the 1950s and the early 1960s. I'm going to be writing another article on this soon because I'm going to look exactly at how this happened. But I discussed it a bit in one of my articles. And, what happened was in the United States Postal Service and the U.S. Customs using an interpretation of a World War II ruling by the Attorney General on a 1938 law. This is once looking into it. Decided that they would that anything that was that they deemed political propaganda would be seized and destroyed, if it was coming from abroad, but in particular from so-called Iron Curtain countries. So we're talking about the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, basically at that time, and some of the East European countries. And this was a massive program. I mean, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of works were destroyed during this period. And there were protests by American book publishers and by scientists as early as the mid-50s. I just recently discovered in old congressional hearings, protesting how this was actually harming national security, and nobody knew what was happening in our archives. The sources the American scholars, including intelligence agents, would be using so-called open source to find out what was happening and what the other side, so to speak, was thinking and saying, weren't available to them in the United States. It was, the category was so broad that just even basic scientific papers that people would share, that scientists were upset they couldn't find because it could be considered propaganda, right? Because if here's a paper with a discovery by a Soviet scientist, well, guess what? That might be political propaganda if you're a McCarthyite Cold Warrior, because it's trying to say that the Soviet Union can do good work in science. But it's not political propaganda, so that wouldn't be allowed in the United States. So this was a massive program. And today, if any of your listeners want to Google postal censorship, guess what? You won't find it. You won't find that this program existed. But it did, and it finally was ruled unconstitutional in 1965. I could go into that whole story. I'll save it for another article. But that's just the degree of censorship. And of course, then you have the American intellectual establishment, much of which was compromised already, the academic establishment and the press, because they worked so closely with the military and intelligence agencies already. Many of them did. And the American government put all of its prestige on the line to say that the charges of biological warfare were false. They were part of a Hate America campaign. And, and that there was no such thing could have happened. There was one other important factor that was entering into this, and this had to do with an agreement that the United States government made with the former heads of leading members of Japan's biological warfare unit itself, known today as Unit 731, which was its largest and central division, but there were others. It was Unit 100, there was the Tama detachment, there was all these other biological warfare, because Japan was in fact, had a massive biological warfare experiment research program. They killed thousands of people. The U.S. today itself admits, as part of their research, they would infect people and then dissect them alive to study the disease process and the various pathogens they were developing and how you deliver them. And their specialty was to deliver them via what are called insect vectors, meaning insects would be, insects would be inoculated with, say, plague, human fleas with plague, and then dropped in various types of delivery devices, bombs and parachutes and all sorts of things, or just dumped into wells and rivers and streams to spread disease. And anyway, after the war was over, the U.S. captured some of these people. They knew about it from intelligence reports that had already been coming in the late stages of the war. They sought them out, they interviewed them, and they made an agreement that they would not prosecute them as war criminals, even though in Germany they were prosecuting the exact same kind of thing as war criminals in Nuremberg. But in the East, they would pretend like it didn't exist. They would hide these people. They literally helped hide the leader of Unit 731, Shiro Ishii, so that the Russians couldn't interrogate him themselves. And because a lot of this happened in northern Manchuria, along the border of the Soviet Union. In fact, there had been an attack by Japanese used biological weapons against the Soviet Union in a border skirmish in Mongolia in 1938 or so. And they hid this and became top secret. It went into intelligence channels, godfathered in by General MacArthur, who was a supreme commander in Far East at that time, and then made operational by the scientists at Fort Detrick, who came out one by one over a period of a few years to interview the Japanese scientists. And by some accounts, some of the Japanese scientists also went to Fort Detrick to work with those people. And it was important to keep this, so it became secret. You couldn't talk about that. You couldn't, if you look at documents about biological warfare, I've looked at many of them, they never, including top secret documents, the history of the Air Force and biological warfare, top secret history, the history of the Chemical Corps. These are in-house histories, by the way, not written by external scholars, but they would do their own internal histories, and they wouldn't talk about it. So that's how deeply it was buried. Meanwhile, some of the people involved in the amnesty program became leading members of the biological warfare program during the Korean War. I mentioned some of them in my article. Edward Wetter is one. He was the executive deputy director of the Biological Warfare Committee for the Research and Development Board, which was the Pentagon's big umbrella weapons development agency, on a large, looking over the entire spectrum of what they were developing. And they had a biological warfare committee, and he was its executive director, and they had sub-panels in the committee, the panel on man, weapons that would attack man, weapons that would attack animals, plants, etc. And so they were well placed, and they knew about, they had taken all of the techniques of the Japanese, and they found them very valuable. And it wasn't the way they necessarily wanted to go. They were going to use their techniques, but what happened was, when the Korean War, most people don't know the history of the Korean War. It's often called the Forgotten War. But the most important thing to remember probably is that the first 6 months or so of the Korean War was kind of insane. I mean, like no other war the United States had ever been in. The war ostensibly started in the middle of late June, June 25th, I think, 1950, when North Korean troops, invaded South Korea. But of course, in Korea, North Korea, South Korea, that was a fiction created by the Americans with the Soviets' assistance. It was just Korea. And in fact, there had already been, basically a civil war was going on, and there was a subject perhaps for another show, but there was tremendous internal strife within South Korea itself. There were a lot of border skirmishes in which thousands were being killed already before the war even began. Anyway, the war begins officially, and North Korea sweeps through South Korea, which was run by corrupt people put in place by the American military government that had ruled South Korea for a couple of years. And they were, these guys had worked with the Japanese, who had been colonized Korea for 30 years. And they were hated. And the North Koreans, who are army, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, swept through South Korea, almost won everything, had pushed the South Korean government, the ROK, or Republic of Korean government, and its American allies down to a little tiny corner of South Korea near Busan. And that ended with a swiftly organized, and I wonder how they were able to organize it so quickly, except that America had massive assets nearby in Japan, of course, still from the war. And they invaded near Seoul at Incheon, kind of came in through the rear, the rear of the North Korean army, cut them off from their supplies. And then they kind of routed the North Koreans, and North Korea retreated all the way up to the border of China, the North Korean forces. And the Americans wanted to go into China. That was MacArthur's thing. And then China, for various reasons, not least its concern about its own existence and its own security, invaded in late October and in November, sent its troops in to help the North Koreans. And when they came in and swept pell-mell, the American forces fell back in one of the worst retreats the United States Army has ever had, maybe ever will have. I don't know, but it was a true defeat for the Americans, and they were swept back below the 38th parallel. I mean, they were, and yeah, I mean, so that the cities of Pyongyang and Seoul were occupied and reoccupied back and forth by different forces multiple times in a period of 6 months. And the war wasn't going so good. And there was a lot of talk about using nuclear weapons at that point. But the Soviet Union now had nuclear weapons, and Truman, rightly so, and others were concerned about World War, having this be a breakout of World War III. Things were very tensed in East Europe. There was a lot of war weariness still from World War II. America may not have suffered the way, say, the Soviet Union or Germany suffered from the war, but together the U.S. and the U.K. had lost 100,000 soldiers in World War II, and that's a lot of people, and there was people that weren't ready for another war. In fact, the Korean War, when it did break out, was not popular, and ultimately Truman was thrown out of office partly because he just could not end the Korean War, which people didn't want. But they didn't, they turned to lacking the use of atomic weapons. They turned to the other weapons of mass destruction, that was biological and chemical weapons. I don't know the extent in which chemical weapons were used, except that napalm, if you want to consider it a chemical weapon, I think it is, was plastered all over North Korea, burning down almost every city, every building. The war in the North went underground. People lived underground. It was hideous. Millions of people were killed or injured, civilians. It was just a nightmarish kind of war. This was throughout the peninsula. So I'm going far afield, but I think your listeners need to understand just how savage the Korean War really was, and how a decision to use biological weapons made sense to a certain coterie within the American military and intelligence agencies. They had numerous, if you read my article, people will see, there were numerous boards that were assembled to study the use and what should we do and what should we use and what are the problems. And what I was surprised to discover, and what this new article, of course, explores in some detail, is the degree to which the CIA was involved in all this. And not just the CIA per se, but the CIA's program of mind control and exploration of behavioral or mind control, as exemplified by Project Bluebird, which was the first that the CIA had. There was a military program before that the Navy had called Project Chatter. But so Project Bluebird, which then basically just changed its name and became, as it grew, and became Project Artichoke. And by mid-1953, the program, Artichoke program, which involved exploring different kinds of drugs to use to regress people, to help hypnotize them, to give them amnesia, to interrogate them, in other words, as part of a massive interrogation program, stimulated by, supposedly by the brainwashing fears that they had way back from these, people. They supposedly believed, maybe they did. I'm unsure of this myself, but they supposedly believed that the communists had developed extremely sophisticated drugs or mind control techniques so that any American captured would be open to giving up information or being used in false confessions or show trials for the communists. And they wanted to combat that even more. They wanted to do it themselves. And they wanted to be able to wipe out, if you're a soldier, or you're on a mission, let's say you're in an airplane flying a germ warfare mission or any kind of covert mission, and there were other kinds of covert missions also, which I mentioned in the article, supporting, say, guerrilla warfare, and you're down and you're captured. They wanted to be able to wipe your mind clean perhaps especially hypnosis seemed like a great idea, because if you say the right word, suddenly now I don't remember. Posting pre-programmed hypnotic commands. Um, it gets so bizarre. It's hard to believe that they believed all this, but I believe they did on some level, and that's what they were following. Um, I don't know if that takes you far into your question there.
Yeah, no. It seems as though it's that what you just described as the whatever the perceived belief was that the Soviets could do, that
Mhm.
the CIA and on down the pipeline and all of these various projects and military tests and such, they wanted a chemical form of that. They wanted a chemical form of, I can remove one thing from your mind, and they wanted it to be able to be controlled and rather seamless in exactly what it did. And they put all these people in various places through horrifying things in that aim because it was so needed. But I have to assume that the fear that the Soviets had it too drove it an unreasonable amount as well.
Right. Yes. To go back, it would be great to. I wish I could, and I'm of course trying to do that, to get back to the very origin of it. And I think, as it turns out, you have to go back to the OSS days, at least in the United States, because the OSS had developed. One thing that we do know about is they had what they called the Truth Serum Committee, and this Truth Serum Committee was organized using. Kind of what would happen later with MK Ultra. There was intelligence people involved in the OSS, and they had reached out to academics or experts in their field, right? Of scientists and psychologists and psychiatrists, and medical doctors, and this thing, it was very top secret. At one point, they were so worried about the security of the Truth Serum work that they went to sites that were controlled as part of the Project Manhattan, the Atom Bomb Project, which was under extreme security. So this was all seen at that level, in other words. And it was overseen, by the way, by a man by the name of Dr. Winfried Overholser. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. And he was the head of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, psychiatric hospital in Washington, D.C. And later, he turns up in this story. And the reason, in fact, I bring him up is I discovered him first because he was the medical expert who examined and was called to testify about how the torture had produced false confessions in the case of Colonel Frank Schwabel, who was a Marine Corps officer who had been shot down and who gave a quite extensive and detailed confession to how the German warfare program came about, who did what, who said what. He charged the Schwabel's confession, which can be read now online. Said that the program was directed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In October 1951, directives were hand delivered down the chain of command, to General Ridgway, commanding general of the Far East Forces, and then further down to the General Wayland, who was the commanding officer of the Far East Air Force, and all the way down the chain of command. And this just blew their minds. You can imagine you're in the Pentagon and you're reading this guy who was the chief of staff or whatever he was. He was a very high official leading a Marine Corps Air Wing, was testifying to all of this. And I say testifying because we call them confessions. The Chinese call them depositions. They had them write up depositions.
Our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters, helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out our honorary producers, and they are Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Zach H., Ren Jacob, Howard Reynolds, Why I Am Anti-War Podcast, Scott Spaulding, Kenneth Cordasco, Korgoth, and the Status Quo Podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our awesome store on Spreadshirt.com for some great Fortress merch. The link is in the show notes. And now, let's get back to the podcast.
So that was pretty shocking, and I'm afraid I got lost. There's so many things in my head. I got lost where I was headed with that.
That's okay.
I apologize.
Just because it was just a cool little aside here, as I was reading through
Overholser. If I could, okay.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Overholser was the guy who was called to testify. So here's the guy. He's just he's called as a medical expert. No one his Schwabel, unlike most people, was put in front of a formal court of inquiry after his return. He had been, in my article, describes how the Counterintelligence Corps worked with him on his recantation of his confession, how they threatened him with prosecution for treason, giving aid to the enemy, which carries a death sentence, and how and basically they did that to all of the Air Force or Marine personnel who confessed. They were all threatened with prosecution for treason, which carries the death penalty. And guess what? They all recanted. In this case, it wasn't anything, as far as I can see, they didn't use fancy MK Ultra or artichoke techniques to get them to recant. They just simply threatened them with, prosecution and death, which is, so Overholser, of course, that was never mentioned at the trial. No one knew his connections to OSS mind control research that was done. So that's an example of how everything that was happening with I know it sounds so conspiratorial to say mind control. Maybe we can come up behavioral control, drug, but I don't know what else to call it. That's what it was. And and I say this as a psychologist, anyone knows in the medical field that any medical knowledge, whether it be psychiatric or maybe bodily or whatever, can be used for harm as well as for good. And that certainly is the case with psychological knowledge. If you want to understand why somebody breaks down because of trauma, guess what? You just understand how to break a person down. And then you can utilize that information. And in fact, that was done by the CIA in its most recent affair with torture under the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques used at Guantanamo and black sites and CIA in the 21st century. So this is how things can occur. I'm sorry, so I'm going to send you back. You just needed to finish the thing on Overholser.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. Going back for just a second to Colonel Schwabel, was there any point, and this may have been from study much later, was there any point where writers or researchers were able to discern how he really felt about that original confession, about what was actually happening in the program? I mean, I'm a former soldier. Just to read that stuff, it blows my mind. Just to think, but we also don't fully comprehend what the conditions were for him when he was
Right.
in captivity and what
Right.
conditions he gave that
Right.
deposition. So
Right. Well, that really does get to some of the core of the controversy, what you bring up. What did he really think? I mean, his confession to the Chinese, he says, you know, I don't have to say this, but I'm going to say it, which is this thing made me sick. I mean, this isn't a quote now, I'm paraphrasing, but
sure,
this was dishonorable to use biological weapons. Nobody I knew liked it. We were all kind of upset about it. Um, and nor did I think that it would even work. It wasn't even an effective weapon. That's what he seemed to think, and it seems genuine when you read it. It doesn't have the feel of a canned thing that some enemy told you to say. But once he's back in the United States, and after being threatened with treason and with the death penalty, he now says, I was tortured to say those things. What I had to say were ridiculous. But as a very sympathetic researcher on Schwabel's life, Raymond Leck, who's now passed away, in his book, and interviewed Schwabel and knew him to some extent, said, he was talked about being held in solitary confinement and being, kind of worn down over a period of, in this case, 3 or 4 months, with poor food and stress positions. He didn't use that term. He himself said, "I wasn't tortured." I don't, I don't want to make it sound. He says like I was tortured, but because in his mind and in many people's mind, torture means they didn't put bamboo under my fingernails. I wasn't waterboarded. I wasn't, they didn't hold a gun to my head. But what they did was use, psychological forms of torture. Although stress positions kind of are borderline case, because that's stress position is have you stand, just sit straight up in a chair and just sit that way for hours. You aren't allowed to sit any other way, and if you do, people come and hit you and make you get back to that position, and it's extremely trying. Whether he was treated that way or not, I can't say for sure. The men who debriefed Schwabel, the psychologists who I mentioned in my article, many of them, they had already been studying torture for some time, and they certainly could have told him to say that. I tend to believe that there was this, of course, the Chinese say that they didn't torture anybody and they treated them very nicely, and the bulk of the prisoners were treated well by the Chinese, not so much the North Koreans, which is another story in the early phases of the war, but it was a very chaotic time. And you can say whatever you want about that, but when China took over the POW's control, they supposedly were all treated very nicely. The exceptions being these few people who had biological warfare knowledge. But when later in the not that long ago, about 10 years ago or so, what was his name? I wrote it down because I sometimes forget it was Lieutenant Kenneth Enoch. Lieutenant Kenneth Enoch was a navigator, and he was another confessor who's Air Force. And his confession was one of the first published and put out. And it was in 1952. And later, and then he recanted as well. He was a high-profile confessor because he was one of the first, and he too said I was tortured, etc. But when he was interviewed by a British journalist, Tim Tate, who was at that time doing a documentary for Al Jazeera, he told him, you can see it online, the documentary is called Dirty Little Lies. And he said, no, he was not abused when he was in captivity, when he was held. He did say that he made up the story about the biological warfare still. He did not say, well, yeah, not only was I not tortured, but I told the truth, but he did say I wasn't tortured. So it certainly calls into doubt. And there was another episode that calls into doubt the story of the torture, and that was the Valley Forge affair, Valley Forge Army Hospital, which I talk about at some length in the article, because what that showed was that the prisoner releases of prisoners held in the Korean War coming back to America took place in two stages, and they're called the little switch and the big switch. The switch of prisoners, in other words, right? So the North Koreans got back, and Chinese get back some of theirs. The Americans get back some of theirs. The first little switch was mostly of people who had been medically, injured prisoners, things like that. People who were compromised on some level. It didn't include any of the confessors of biological warfare, to my knowledge. And this was in spring of 1953. The war was still going on. And there were only about 350 or so prisoners that were going to be released. But a little less than 10% of them had been identified by American intelligence as so-called hardcore cases. These were people who were hardcore communists, that these people had been converted or brainwashed to be for the Chinese and communist side. And that the CIA had heard of this, got word of it, and when the prisoners were set to come back to the United States, this subset of so-called hardcore prisoners and others who were dubious on some level, or they were worried about a couple dozen of them, were sent to Valley Forge Army Hospital in Pennsylvania under armed guard the entire way. And they were going to do artichoke-style interrogations on them. And just so your audience knows, well, what's an artichoke-style interrogation? What was the state of art of CIA interrogation in those days? And they were still honing their craft. I mean, they were using these things for interrogations, and then they were studying it as well. They were using it to study how human beings react under stress. They were using it to study ways to produce amnesia in individuals, studying ways to break down personality and then reconstruct it. Later, it would take, I know you wanted to talk about this. Later, it took a massive form of MK Ultra and found its worst, possibly, I'd say probably so, its worst example in the famous experiments of Ewan Cameron in Montreal in the mid to late 50s, which was, well, we can get to that, but which my article goes into, and which was overseen by, on the CIA side, by the same man who was in charge of overseeing the study of the returning Air Force prisoners who had confessed to biological warfare. His name was James L. Monroe, the same guy. But anyway, we'll come back to that. I mean, this is just, it kind of, even as I say these things myself, I don't know how your listeners feel about this, but it continues to blow my mind that all these things occurred.
They're used to having their minds blown by people like you, so it's
okay.
perfectly all right.
Well, I've studied this thing now for some years, and I still continue to be surprised by new findings. But I was talking about the returnees at Valley Forge and the artichoke people, and I linked to the documents in my article. They wanted to run their standard artichoke approach. And what was that? They would drug people with various kinds of drugs that they had, primarily barbiturates, truth drugs like sodium amytal, but also scopolamine and others, and potentially also use electric shock or insulin shock to scramble their minds.
What's insulin shock?
Insulin shock. They give you insulin, so much of it, you kind of, your body goes into convulsions. Both of them produce convulsions. ECT, or electric shock therapy, so-called treatment, or insulin shock. There was another drug they used too, and since I can't think of its name, it starts with an M. I wrote about it once, but I'll leave that go. But there are various ways in which to scramble the mind. So I think they settled more on ECT, which is what they would use. And then later, of course, they would discover LSD and start using that. And the idea was to use that in conjunction with hypnosis, deep hypnosis, and other forms of interrogation to get people to supposedly confess themselves about things. And they were using, there was a plan made up for the Valley Forge interrogations, and it included an experimental drug whose name is still classified, that would produce disorientation in the prisoners. And I mean, remember, these were people who were imprisoned American POWs, brought back to the United States, sent to an army hospital where they were going to be given electric shock, hypnotized, who knows what, to in an experiment, an interrogation experiment, because these people were supposedly had been recruited to communism. As it turned out, and as it turned out, this is another bizarre aspect from my standpoint that came up, and I mentioned it in the article. Internally, what happened was the initial plan fell apart. At least officially, it fell apart. The families of the prisoners knew that their loved ones were being sent back under armed guard. They knew that they were going to be given some kind of weird psychological treatment, right? And they started protesting. And so much so that a high-ranking CIA officer hightailed it out there to the site to kind of, unruffle some feathers and see what was really going on. And in the end, kind of put a stop to it at that moment anyway. And also some congressional people were starting to ask questions. The security of the operation was collapsing, in other words. And they called it off, although they still worked with Army and interrogators. Remember, these were all Army people. The Air Force people had not been released. They were working with Army, CID, and interrogators, and providing some kind of unspecified assistance. Someone wonders what that was. But later, we see in other reports that the CIA ultimately did go back and do its interrogations. And to the extent they were artichoke interrogations, I'm not sure, but I don't know what else they would be doing, because there was no reason for them to be there if CID had already interrogated. So, but internally, as the CIA is reporting on this to other people, I have two reports, one to the Psychological Strategy Board, which was a high-level joint agency established under the Truman, I think still under Truman, under Truman. We had State Department officials and head of the CIA and others were involved in looking at psychological warfare and plotting that out and trying to coordinate this across all the different U.S. agencies. And they were told that there was nobody really of any intelligence interest at Valley Forge. We looked into it, or the Army interrogators. Turned out there was like one guy maybe who was a little bit fishy, and we're going to look into him more, and that was it. But when they were debriefing the FBI on this, they told FBI officials, including Hoover, that no, wow, these guys were the worst of the worst, and it showed us that actually the American influenced soldiers, brainwashed to be communists, had taken over prisoner of war camps and were running them in Korea. Unbelievable. I don't think Hoover believed it for a second, by the way. Hoover was very dubious about the CIA. Hoover himself is kind of a monster himself, but he didn't trust the CIA. Of course, they were in competition in various ways too, and that's one reason. But so they lied to the FBI about it. And then in another report internally to another part of the CIA, they mentioned in passing that we have officers who are going back to Valley Forge and they're going to do the interrogations there. And so stuff went on. We still don't know the whole story, but what we do know is still pretty damning, and it throws a very dark shadow across the claims that the United States was making that the communists were brainwashing prisoners, torturing them, when in fact the exact same prisoners being brought back to the United States were plans to torture them, essentially. What really went on. In the article also goes a good deal into exactly what did happen to the soldiers who were returning, the Air Force personnel and others.
I was going to ask. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No. I was I'm assuming we don't have anywhere near all the information about who it actually happened to the soldiers, Air Force.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, supposedly, according again, researcher Raymond Leck, who worked on the Schwabel case and looked into these things quite a bit, The record of the interrogations of the returning POWs were lost in a fire in the 1980s. They're gone. But so instead, what we have, and the investigations themselves were classified and top secret, and still, in fact, don't have access to them. But slowly but surely and painstakingly, from my standpoint, who tried to look into it, we're able to determine what did happen. There was a report in 1955, which I linked to in my article, which had a number of people involved from the CIA and the DOD and academics, et cetera, and CIC, Counterintelligence Corps, which was also heavily involved in the debriefing of the returning POWs. In fact, the man who was in charge of Schwabel's debriefing, initially as he was returning to the United States aboard ship, Lieutenant Matthews was a member of the CIC Counterintelligence Corps. It's still a very highly secret component of American intelligence, now defunct. But you can only find like really one decent book even about them ever written on the history of the CIC. That's how secret they were. Anyway, sorry, I'm losing. I'm trying to get back to where I was. The Air Force. It turned out there were two major research projects going on to study the returning POWs. One was Army, and one was Air Force. And there were also, of course, a couple of Marine officers, just two, and they seemed to have fallen through the cracks a little bit because there was no Marine Corps special agency. There was a Marine Corps board. The Marine Corps was kind of under the Navy administratively, but the primary research was done out of Maxwell Air Force Base, since almost everyone we're talking about here was Air Force, the 23 of them. And there was an officer education research laboratory out there at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. And at the same Air Force Base, there was something called the Air Force Human Resources Research Institute, or HRRI. And they worked very closely together, and they worked on something called Project Repair. And Project Repair was the top secret, high-level study of the returning Air Force prisoners who confessed. And it's probably where people were like Dr. Louis, well, in fact, we know that Dr. Louis West, who later was a key MK Ultra figure, was also, interestingly enough, I throw it in here, the man who examined Jack Ruby for the government after after the assassination of Kennedy and Oswald. But and then he did a lot of other things too. And so Project Repair, the guy placed in charge of Project Repair was Lieutenant Colonel James Monroe. There he is again. James Monroe. Who is this guy? In fact, it's interesting. You find certain people in the military. Now, you're in the military. You can tell me. But there's guys who become kind of heroes. They become like star figures, it seems to me. I wasn't in the military. But so, for instance, James Monroe was famous because he had, in World War II, back as a major in World War II, he had, the U.S. was having some problems in their delivery of propaganda leaflets over Europe. World War II. But basically what they did is they would go up in an airplane and they'd have like incredible massive load of leaflets. And they would just dump them out of the plane, right? Leaflets would fly everywhere. And, it was kind of messy, and it really didn't get to where it couldn't be well targeted, in other words. So he developed a leaflet bomb. And it was a 500-pound bomb or so that had chambers in it, and you could put the leaflets in the chambers and have a timed fuse, and you could pretty accurately, over a few hundred yards area, deliver the leaflets that you wanted to deliver. It's called, and they called it. It became famously known as the Monroe Bomb, and he was a hero in the psychological warfare component of World War II, and became well known and was written up in the press. I mean, this wasn't a covert thing later, the Monroe Bomb, that's what they called it. when the Korean War came around, they had, and the need for use of biological weapons munitions was imminent, was important, because they didn't have um, the munitions ready to go for their biological warfare campaign. They turned to the use of the CIA actually developed it at Fort Detrick as part of the Special Operations Division that was there, where your listeners might be interested to know one of its leaders was, now I'm blanking on the name, Frank Olson was involved in this. And, they morphed instead of leaflets, they put, feathers, turkey feathers mostly, inoculated with various types of diseases, dusted with anthrax, et cetera, and used it instead of leaflets in the chambers of the propaganda bomb and dropped them on North Korea and China. And this even came out at the time in a little bit of a mini scandal when the head of a congressional committee who had just been briefed by a general came out and told people, we don't need fancy weapons for biological war. We already have weapons on hand that can deliver biological weaponry. And I'm thinking here he says of the leaflet bomb. What? It was like, why did he say? Of course, the American military got on that fast. Oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. We didn't say that. He's mistaken. So anyway, Monroe is the head of this Project Repair, and we don't know a lot what happened. They gathered a group of different, maybe a few dozen doctors, psychiatrists, academic types, again, some of the military, some not, to work on intensively interview. We don't know everything that happened, perhaps experiment upon. Were some of these people objects of artichoke experiments, for instance? It certainly seems possible. But we just don't know. That was pure speculation on my part. But you do have the same kinds of people around. And we do know that they were intricately involved with biological warfare campaign. So, for instance, the Human Resources Research Institute, HRRI, at Maxwell Air Force Base, its parent agency was Air Research and Development Command, ARDC, in Maxwell, also headquartered in Maxwell Air Force Base. ARDC, if you look through the materials, was heavily involved in the implementation and development of biological warfare munitions. So you have the agency, the parent agency, an investigation whose parent agency was part of the biological warfare development hierarchy and campaign, which then does its own investigation of the people who confess to the use of biological warfare. Something's not right here. And in fact, so over and over you see that these are just fake investigations. Back to the Schwabel trial. There were 3 officers, who were going to, high-ranking officers who were going to, well, maybe it was 4. It was 3 or 4, I'm sorry. I'd have to look back. But anyway, of the 3 or 4 officers who were in charge of the decision that would be made on Schwabel as to whether or not he was guilty, a traitor, or should be, implemented, what kind of punishment we should deal out to him, was a man by the name of General Schilt. General Schilt was actually named in Schwabel's own confession as one of the major officers involved in the chain of command of biological warfare. And yet why would he be, there's no way that guy should be judging Schwabel on what he's doing. How could that be? Of course, it's never mentioned. No one's ever, even Raymond Leck seemed to have flown by him. Although I know Leck published Schwabel's confession. He knows what's in it. He knew who was on the board. I don't know why he ignored that, but I think he had already convinced himself that Schwabel was telling the truth about being tortured and having false confessions. And, there's something, that in psychology, and I can say this as a psychologist, it's called confirmation bias, which is the short way of saying it is we believe what we want to believe. We believe what we've been taught to believe. Right. And when you're faced with something different, it produces a state of internal confusion or anxiety, sometimes called cognitive dissonance. And the default is to go to that which is known and not necessarily accept that which is, highly discordant with your own major views. And I realize that that's what I'm doing in many ways in my work. And what I'm proposing here is a revisionist history of the Cold War. I mean, a lot of it's already known. MK Ultra is not my discovery. A lot of really good researchers have written books and studied and done an incredible amount of work on it. And a lot of the things I get are coming from other people. I'm drawing together from other people. But everything that I'm talking about in terms of the investigation into the flyers, by the military and the CIA, about the confessions, which were not published. Remember, I mentioned the censorship. Your listeners at the beginning of this interview, I brought up, well, those confessions were published, but they never reached the United States. What really got me first interested in pursuing this is in the dogged way that I ultimately did, was that I too was like the researchers back in the 50s who testified to troubles with this censorship. When I heard that the United States government was involved in torture in black sites in Iraq and Guantanamo, as a psychologist myself, and I heard that psychologists were involved in this, I started reading about it like many people did. I read my New York Times articles, and it said, yeah, these people, were these psychologists in the CIA had recreated the forms of interrogation used by the Chinese communists to create false confessions during the Korean War. And so it's pretty easy to sit down at Google and say, well, false confessions, Korean War, what are they talking about? Oh, it's biological warfare. I didn't even know about that. Okay. And then, well, we should be able to read those confessions. I would be curious to see what they said. I want to see how outlandish. I had worked, which listeners may or may not know, I had already been working for a number of years with torture victims. Part of my psychological practice before I retired was with Survivors International Torture Treatment Center in San Francisco Bay Area. Your listeners may not know that there are torture treatment centers in the United States in various different cities. And there are even in other countries around the world because unfortunately, many, many countries still practice torture. And many of these torture victims had come to the United States where they sought political asylum based on persecution, and their claims for persecution were based on the evidence of having been tortured. And my job was to help them document that if they could by extensive psychological examination reports. In some cases, I also did psychotherapy with torture victims. So I was very interested, as you can see, in the subject of torture. And so I thought it would be helpful to me in understanding my clients and just a basic historical interest to read the confessions, the tortured confessions, and see how they lined up with what was happening in Iraq or Guantanamo and my own clients. And I couldn't find it. I just, where are these confessions? I looked online, I couldn't find them. My libraries couldn't find it. I ultimately secured a copy from Great Britain. And only this year did I discover, and the same thing, by the way, with another report where some of the confessions had been published in a report by the International Scientific Commission, an ad hoc group put together by the World Peace Council in 1952 to investigate the allegations at that time. It was left-wing, et cetera. And But it was headed by a very famous British scientist by the name of Joseph Needham, who was very well known in the world. And they concluded that the charges of biological warfare made by China and North Korea were correct. And they published some of the 4 confessions as part of an appendix to their report, along with a lot of other appendices of backing their findings. And I couldn't find that either. So that started to be suspicious to me. Why is it I can't find the very evidence that they're talking about on this? The Korean War I know was a long time ago, but you can find stuff from World War II, and that's even longer ago. How could I not find? I could find what high German officers were saying to themselves in captivity, between themselves in captivity at Nuremberg. I could find that, but I couldn't find what the confessions were that were at the time very famous and had plastered, and was a huge controversy in the United States. And we're not, anyway, I did find them, and ultimately, and I've worked a long time looking, I wanted to research more the background to all of this before I wrote about it. Of course, for many years, I was still working and as a working psychologist, and like any person who works, I didn't have a lot of time for research and writing. So only recently have I been able to finally, put my attentions to the subject and begin to write more about it. Hopefully I've answered your question and maybe a bit more.
Yeah.
Of what Schwabel felt. Yeah. I wish I knew exactly what he felt. For what any of these officers went through, I don't know. It's very complex. I'm sure that he was not, I do believe he was not happy with himself. He probably thought he was weak for having broken to the extent that he did, collaborate to the extent he did. And by the way, in the trial and in Lech's book on Schwabel, and Lech, who believes Schwabel was tortured, etc., admits and the quotes attorney at the trial that of many aspects that Schwabel reported that were true. Right, just over and over again, the secret things that shouldn't have been talked about. Right, chain of including operational information that was then current happening. That's like treason, right? Oh yeah, secret airbase K8. Oh yeah, well K8's at this city. Here's where it's located. Yep. Here's the guy in charge. What? That's treason. Well, it's not treating her captive, was it? As it turns out, the United States government never gave specific instructions at that point in time of what people were supposed to do when they were captured. They said, it's supposed to be name, rank, and serial number. No, that wasn't it. That wasn't it. That came later, right? At the time, you just, in fact, it was the fact that they didn't have much guidance that was there was out of that controversy arose a major new controversy over exactly what kind of rules of should be promulgated for a prisoner, for captured personnel, and code of conduct, and that could be an article or a story in and of itself. And the new code of conduct came out of the Korean War experience, but it didn't exist before it.
Well, Doc, I think that's a good place for us to pause for today. I know you and I talked a little bit offline about some other things that I had scripted out, so I would love it for you to. No, sure. It's important to take that way. I have more time to read too.
Right.
But I would love for you to come back here in the next week or two when you have time, and we can keep talking about this. It's incredibly fascinating and incredibly disturbing as well. The implications for what some of our countrymen went through, and that no one knows about it. That very few people. But I really applaud your efforts to be part of this, to research it, to go after it in a devoutly journalistic fashion. I think that it's really important subjects. Especially, and like you and I talked about offline about discussing the military law enforcement interrogation aspects of it. There's I'm wanting to go back into that history a bit and try to understand when and where some of those things came around. Talking about the Reed techniques and the Mr. I can't remember his first name at the moment, but the fellow that founded his agency and everything, and his like you mentioned, his connections to the CIA.
They were looking. Artichoke was looking at the Reed work Reed was doing, Reed and Associates, and it's still, I don't know. I immediately wrote that off to a guy I know who used to be an interrogator for NCIS, and he was interested, but I don't know that he knew about it, anything more about it. I don't think. That came from a document. And by the way, so as your listeners know, everything that I talk about is documented. Everything, a lot of journalism articles you'll read, and they'll say, this happened, that person said this, but you just have to take their word for it. I provide a link, and the link is usually to an original document. Either that document might be from the CIA, it might be from the FBI, it might be from, as they say, an official history in-house within some military agency, or it could be the communications intelligence reports that were later published by the CIA. These things are all there to be looked at, because history and journalism too needs to be checked. Just because I
Absolutely.
say this doesn't mean that it's true. And so I want people to look at, that's the spirit that began my whole investigation. If the New York Times says these things are false confessions based on Chinese torture, where's the evidence? They don't provide the evidence. Or if they do, it goes to a history book that just states it and also doesn't provide the evidence. So, and when there is evidence contrary, I link to that as well. So links, for instance, to the retractions of the flyers who did retract that have been published, I link to those, and you can read what their stories of torture and what they had to say and why they were retracting. So it's all out there to be examined. And thank you very much for inviting me on. I certainly will come back.
Absolutely, Dr. Abu. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'll talk again soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not detain